All right, just about a minute or so after the top of the hour. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today on 7 tips for leveraging data in an age of disruption. I'm Kevin Burke, Director of Digital Marketing here at Data Axle. And on behalf of all of us here, thank you so much. And we're excited that we are able to connect with you today on this topic. Just some quick housekeeping before we dive in. Questions are encouraged. However, due to the number of attendees we have on the line, we are muting everyone. However, you can enter your question into the Q&A feature, and we'll get to as many as we can once we wrap up the presentation, which is, by the way, being recorded. You'll be emailed a link to this once we wrap up. So without further ado, I have the honor of bringing in our Chief Product Officer, Rohan Chandran, who will tell a little bit more about himself and then walk us through the content for today. So with that, Rohan, welcome and over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. And thanks everyone for taking the time out today. Much appreciated. I'll start with a little bit about myself, as a lot of you, I think, don't know me. I lead our product, engineering, data, and all those related operations teams at Data Axle, the build it side of the house, if you will. Over my career, I've been a failed founder, a successful founder. I've worked at other startups and grown them. I've worked at big public companies too. So I've run the whole gamut in that regard. But at the heart of everything I've done has been data in all shapes and sizes, whether I was immersed in ad tech in several roles, or working in the navigation and automotive space, or building consumer experiences, or indeed a massive financial services ecosystem. And on that journey, I've actually been a customer of Data Axle a few times in a similar position to many of you today, before switching sides for the last 2.5 years that I've been here, which has helped me, I think, bring a customer-centered viewpoint into what we do and how we need to evolve it. So today, if we've nailed this webinar, I'm going to share a bunch of tips that are going to make so much sense that you're going to think, I knew that. And you likely did, because you're smart folk who are dealing with this every day. But what I'm aiming to do here is also bring all those things that you might have known into a more structured framework and thought process that will hopefully serve as a good launching pad for you to make decisions around your data investments. I can't solve the world's problems in 30 minutes, but there should be plenty of food for thought for you. And our team is, of course, happy to connect individually after this and talk in more depth. So let's talk a little bit about this age of disruption, as we've titled it, which I know sounds like a Marvel movie. And it's hard to look back at the last 2 years with COVID and a war and the all sorts going on at the macroeconomic level and not really wonder if there's a script writer out there just toying with us. But it's easy to think that with all of this going on, that we've had this sharp change in direction and that everything is different. But as you dig into the trends, what actually appears to be emerging is one fundamental undercurrent. And that is a sharp increase in volatility, which is largely driven by all these externalities that I was just mentioning for most of us. But actually, as you go in even further than that, that represents an abrupt, certainly, but a significant acceleration of pre-existing trends. Much of what we're seeing was actually happening before, but it's like the afterburners have been turned on. And this is affecting both businesses whose very nature and characteristics are changing, and all of us as individuals and as consumers. Our whole work-life equilibrium has shifted, I think, probably for everyone on this webinar. And we're all seeking this new normal, whatever that may actually turn out to be. So it's been a crazy couple of years, and these numbers you can see in front of you right now are just actually incredible to think about the scope of change that's been happening, particularly in the business world. And to stress the acceleration that I referenced during the heart of the pandemic itself, that sort of year or so that COVID was everything, we saw about a 40% surge in changes versus the equivalent months in the prior pandemic-free period. And more importantly, while there's been some dampening out of that as we resume into a sort of semi-post-pandemic world, I guess, we are continuing to see an elevated pace of change. It's like a step function has happened and it's here to stay. So it's not going to surprise, I think, anyone that 1.5 million businesses permanently shut their doors in that core COVID period. And that's several multiples more than we would have usually seen in that span of time. But that number, I think, just puts a reality that we all knew or suspected into stark relief, right? That's approaching 10% of all the open and active businesses that we track, which is huge. Perhaps a little more surprising is that almost as many businesses actually opened during that same period of time. It was about 1.3 million that we tracked in that period. And while that's maybe down on a normal number of openings by a little bit, it does paint a picture of opportunity emerging even in the toughest of times. And it's something, as we think about all of this, that we should all be aware of, whatever our line of business. The most fascinating stat, actually, to me, is in the ownership changes, where we've seen almost an order of magnitude increase in the changes in the owner of record of a business. So that's, small businesses maybe selling, exiting, and transferring to someone else. And we've just never seen anything happen at that sort of scale. And that, for us at Data Axle, and for probably all of you, has meant a real disruption. We can't be the same Data Axle that we were and just rest on those laurels. Yes, we knew this change was coming, but I think few of us realized how fast it would be, as I've mentioned. So our old data sources are still rock solid, but we've had to incorporate new sources and new mechanisms to get faster and more precise data. And we've had to adjust our operational processes, our AI models, and so on to drive the validation of that data. Our goal at the end of the day is to make sure we're providing a product, our data, that is valuable and current, and to ensure that our mechanisms are enabling us to do that continually. And this all matters to you because that's how you're going to be providing value to your customers and partners. So as we evolve in this age of disruption, all of you need to be thinking about how you should approach things as well, just as we've changed. It doesn't really matter what industry you're in, you're going to need to be up to date, to have up-to-date and validated information to ensure that you're providing the best products and services to your customers. And so with that, we've put together 7 tips that will help you hopefully achieve that. So real time, we hear this a lot. I'm sure you guys hear this every day in conversation. We're in this age of instant gratification. Why wait if you can have something now, right? I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time debating how to define real time. It means slightly different things to different people. And that's something you have to figure out individually. But what I am going to do is sketch a picture of why you need to think long and hard about this so that you can establish what's actually going to be right for you. So on an average weekday, we capture in our database about 8,000 new businesses springing to life. That's a large number if you think about it. Now, of course, that fluctuates like crazy, right? It might be closer to 0 on December 25th and a lot higher as winter gives way to spring each year. And some of these businesses last. Many of them, unfortunately, fail within months, and many more open but turn out to not do very much beyond that because they're shell businesses that someone's opened from their own home. So there's a lot of noise in that we have to deal with on a daily basis. And as you can see on this slide, some of the examples in there, there's a lot of other changes going on daily, right? This is just one day last week that we pulled numbers for. And at the end of this webinar, I'm going to take a slight risk and pull some live numbers from our internal tools of what's changed during the time we've been speaking. We are in the middle of the holiday season, I know, but there's plenty happening. It's a Thursday, so I'm expecting some interesting numbers to transpire that will, again, give you a flavor of just the dynamic nature of all of this data. And so with that kind of scale of rapid change, even if you're refreshing your data weekly, you can actually risk getting left a long way behind, right? Just multiply those numbers by 7 and think about the potential impact. The onset of atrophy is pretty quick, and you have to be aware. It's not quite like losing half the value of a new car when it drives off the lot, but it is close to that. Although as I say that, that's probably not the best analogy these days, given that cars apparently increase in value in the used car market. So think about, some of you work in the navigation space or local search space. If a business location moves or changes its operating hours or simply just its phone number, you're actually going to need to know right away because people are depending on that data to go about their daily lives. And if you're consistently late to the game with those small changes, you will find that trust with your customers eventually erodes. And that's a hard thing to recapture. And of course, there's no perfect solution, right? If Rohan's ice cream store decides to start closing early, but I don't do anything other than flip that sign on the door a little earlier every day, we might not find out immediately. But for us at Data Axle, part of our massive AI and human process is to ensure that we find out sooner rather than later. And more importantly, once we find out, we ensure that that information is disseminated out to our customers through our systems. But the gating factor for you is always going to be the frequency at which you're consuming that data. And a similar scenario applies if you're a direct marketer, right? Just think back to the business ownership changes that I referenced earlier. If you send new owner Michelle an email addressed to former owner Rohan, you've right there and then hugely reduced your chances of a response and a conversion on that email. And it's not just ownership changes, right? It's job changes. Think about the great resignation that we've all seen over the last couple of years. And tied with that has been role changes within organizations, right? As companies refine and adjust their org structures because they're working from home more and the way they need to operate changes. So real-time data through APIs can absolutely be the solution here. And it's certainly no surprise to me or to us at DataAxle that more and more of our customers are going down that route, both as their capability to ingest it evolves and the data and the use cases demanded. But that brings me to an absolutely critical point here. I would dearly love, right, honestly, to stand up here and exhort every single one of you to consume all of your data via this continuous real-time fire hose. That would be great for us, but it would be a little disingenuous of me to do that. What you really need to be doing is understanding the possibilities that doing so opens up and the value that you can derive. But then you need to take a long, hard look at your use case or use cases and determine where is it imperative for me to have real-time data? Where might it be an added bonus? And where is it that honestly, it doesn't actually transform the outcome sufficiently to justify the cost and effort that's involved? That's something our team can certainly help you think through. And that's why there are a whole plethora of options available to you in our systems, right? Take the data real time or daily or weekly, all the way through a few of our customers who, because it suits their context, they take in the data on an annual basis. So to give you a little expert edge as you think about this one, make sure that you consider the granularity of use case as you're thinking about real time or not. If you or your customers are operating against individual data cells, right, a single attribute of a single entity, then almost by definition, any minor evolution of the data can have an outsized impact on outcomes. A business may look pretty much the same when you zoom out at the macro level, but if it no longer opens on Tuesdays, that's something we've seen with a lot of restaurants, for example, who are just reducing their hours because of staffing shortages, then your navigation product end user could have taken a long walk or drive only to be frustrated by a closed shop when they get there. And that's an experience you want to be well ahead of. And so you're going to want to be much closer to the real-time end of the spectrum if you're at that granular level. But if you step back and perhaps some of you are operating at a macro level, let's say you're doing analytics in aggregate to inform some statewide or even nationwide strategic decision, maybe you're rolling out a new product or service, then that daily change is most likely almost noise to you that's going to be handled and incorporated in the models you're applying to make those decisions. And perhaps a monthly or quarterly update is more appropriate. So always look at that granularity when you're trying to make that decision of, should I really go all the way to real time? Now, change is, as we all know, and there are plenty of quotes about this, it's always going to be constant. We can't fight this change that's going on. We need to accept and embrace it as we go forward. We've talked a little bit just now about how businesses are coming and going and shifting their operations, but this transformation is also happening at an industry level. Look at some of these logos on there and think about the ones that you recognize or maybe don't recognize at all, which says something. We're seeing whole categories disappear before our very eyes, right? I'm hoping some of you like me are old enough to remember taking rolls of film to a photo lab and then coming back 3 days later to pick up the photos and then discovering that you're really bad at keeping things in focus. But that's not a thing anymore. And there are brands that no longer exist. They were core in our lives, and you can see some of them in the top row here, and then they're gone. Though, Toys R Us was one I would have put in that category, but apparently they're making their big comeback, so we should never give up hope. And some brands have just changed their business model completely. So the bottom row here are companies that used to have massive physical retail presences, and they have moved completely online. I used to buy clothes for my kids when they were that age at Gymboree and go into the stores and do it. Not a thing anymore. Was even going to have Kodak on this list, but they're a company I haven't quite figured out yet, given that they still contradict what I just said and produce a film camera aimed at consumers. But while many things are disappearing, there's a lot of new things that are taking their place, right? That cycle of reinvention is incessant, but again, in the last decade or two, and even more in the last year or two, it's been accelerated. The whole gig economy, right, represented by the Ubers and the Lyfts and the DoorDashes and the Fivers and everyone else, that wasn't a thing when I started my career. And it's absolutely dominant in our lives today. The CBD industry is one of the 12,000 or so industries that we track and monitor closely. And there are almost 6,000 dispensaries now that we track, and we track that down to the level of identifying whether they offer medical marijuana or recreational marijuana or both. Again, this wasn't a thing a little while ago. Food businesses are absolutely insane, the explosion we're seeing there, right? Just this year, we've added several thousand delivery businesses, meal kit services, virtual or ghost kitchens where you can, order from multiple restaurants at the same time, which is really useful for my family because we have 4 different dietary preferences. And we've even added 500 paint and sips, which for those of you who are like me and don't get out enough, are apparently establishments where you can down a nice bottle or 2 while you paint. And for those people who've seen my art when I'm sober, that would be an interesting experience. And there are also transient but essential businesses. Very obviously, the COVID testing and vaccination sites that sprung up over the last couple of years are a perfect example, where we've tracked 40,000 locations, that opened, closed, reopened, moved, changed their hours and rules, and a whole lot more. So for a little expert edge again on this topic, a lot of our customers explicitly filter or look at particular industry codes, SIC or NAICS codes. And that's important because their business is tied to certain industries and serves certain industries. And we absolutely encourage this, right? All of you don't need all the data on all the businesses. You need to refine it for what's important to you. And you've got to know your context and operate within that. But as you've just seen, there are a lot of macro and micro fluctuations that are going on in those industries within those codes, new codes being added, codes being removed as stuff evolves. And it's really important that you take a few minutes, maybe on a quarterly basis, to review whether you're capturing the right set of codes for you. As an example, right, if you were in the business of supplying takeout containers to restaurants, you would have wanted to be well ahead of this whole new industry of virtual kitchens and food delivery services, all of whom likely have a demand for your product before or as they're opening up, so that you can be on top of that surge. Excuse me there. So my guess is that several of you, perhaps even the majority, are connected from home today. And at Data Axle, we're very much a remote first company. Only time's going to tell whether that's been a good or bad thing, but either which way, it's really here to stay. And I think it's going to be a positive overall. And that's the noise we hear in the industry. I think we'd be mistaken to think this as a consequence purely of COVID. The notion of being able to work from anywhere in the world, including right up at 35,000 feet over the ocean with your in-flight Wi-Fi these days, that was already catching on and becoming a thing. Again, I don't know good or bad, but it's definitely a thing. And it's another example of something that was happening, as I said before, but has been catapulted into prime time. And it's something that we've identified and been prepared for, but it's still, managed to take us by surprise as we go through. And the shift that's happening here, as we're seeing, is more nuanced than just people working from home with increased frequency, which is often what it gets labeled as in the media. It's a lot more about the blurring of the boundary between what constitutes work and what constitutes home, right? The line between, if I take myself as an example, right, between me as the Chief Product Officer of Data Axle and me as the cricketer, avid reader, mediocre but very willing chef and husband and father, it's not a solid line that separates those two, as perhaps it was for most people years ago. And frankly, nor do I want it to be that. I'm all of those things, and I'm embracing it. And so the rigid 9 to 5 workday is just increasingly a thing of the past. I think more and more the modern worker, we see this very clearly at Data Axle. I'm sure most of you do as well. Whether they're junior or in the C-suite, they want to put in the hours and get the job done, but they want to do it when it works with their life as a whole unit, right? We see the movement for the 4-day working week starting to take hold, particularly in Europe. There's a lot of large-scale experiments being run there right now. I know, speaking for myself again, right? I might take off in the middle of the day to watch my child's performance, and I might also be working at or beyond midnight because inspiration has struck, or I need to churn something out, like prepare for a webinar. That fluidity, though, is actually a positive in my life, and I think increasingly so for most people. And in this universe, right, the border between an individual's professional and personal life is not what it used to be, as I said. And as you're trying to both understand an individual and reach them in their business context even, you need that more comprehensive perspective to be effective. And this really perhaps is the end game of account-based marketing as you get more and more granular and tight and precise and individualized with your messaging to be able to be that precise. So this hits in a couple of ways. The first is being more custom and tailored with your message. Now, I'm sure you're all looking at that and saying, well, yeah, and absolutely right. That's not rocket science to understand. The more you understand about someone, the more you can craft your communication, and knowing your audience is everything. We offer a B2C link product, and I'm not here to sell that, but what that's about is combining the profile of the individual as a worker at a business and their consumer profile. And the more you start looking at and seeing the consumer and the professional as one person, one human being, you can take your messaging and the tailoring of that to another level, which is going to be critical for success. The other benefit you get from that combined perspective is the expansion of your reach that ensues, right? I'll use myself as an example again. I told you a little bit about how I operate. And the upshot of that is that if you want to grab my attention, you might often be more effective reaching me at my personal email address if I've opted in, or perhaps via social media. And there may be many times where I'm more likely to pay attention to your message in that form at midnight than I am if it comes into my work email inbox at 10 a.m. when I'm, frantically getting ready for this webinar, for example. Now, I'm not saying that's everyone today, right? I'm sure plenty of you differ, and there's a lot of people who still want to maintain that separation. So there are waters to navigate here for sure. But if you think back 25 years, that's where the conversation was when we were talking about marketing to people at their work email address, right? It was, do you really want to get into their inbox? Aren't they doing their work here? And are you gonna get in and mess with them in the wrong place? So for our expert edge here, I want to emphasize something that, again, it's a buzzword we hear a lot about, but really critical, right? We all know that one message and one interaction rarely suffice with a marketing message. The real opportunity here in the path to success lies in taking that omni-channel approach. Again, not a new buzzword or concept, but if you're able to create a well-crafted message that is pointed but not intrusive and is stitched together across an individual's journey, and I talked a little bit about how my day functions and where you might want to hit me. If you can do that, you're absolutely going to transform your response rates. Again, I'm not a sample size that you can draw conclusions from, but I see that in myself, and we see that result with customers we're working with today, right? Our agency team, if you want, will gladly share stories of how that omni-channel approach has elevated returns on marketing spend for a lot of our customers. So please do feel free to reach out there. When we talk about data, right, we started talking a little bit about consumer data here, then the conversation about privacy and compliance is, of course, an essential one. Barely a day goes by without news of another data breach, right? I'm sure you're all reading these all the time. And the truth is, most of them are small, and many of them have very limited material impact. I use that word in air quotes for sure. But occasionally, and all too frequently, there's a significant one and a serious one. And each time that happens, very justifiably and reasonably, awareness is heightened and people are more and more conscious of the impact of this, right? This is a very real threat. It's a growing one, and it's one that we have to be on top of. And the concern is not it's not a nebulous or speculative one either, right? Data from McKinsey tells us that the majority of businesses and consumers are already pretty adamant about their reluctance or unwillingness to work with companies where they might have questionable or potentially questionable security and data practices. And that's a number that is only going to converge close to 100% over time. No one wants to be on the wrong side of that equation. And for all of you as customers of that data, it's unfortunately not ever going to be sufficient to say, well, the data I'm leveraging came from someone else, so it's their problem to worry about being on top of all this. Absolutely, right? Of course, you want your partner to be on top of this, and you shouldn't have a compromise on that. But it's critical that you're ensuring that you are standing where you need to be stood in this regard, right? So there are three things I want to highlight, and there's a whole lot more depth behind this, but three in particular that I think you need to make sure you're doing and are staffed and structured and organized in order to do so. The first is that the data you're receiving, you want to ensure that you are getting the data you want and you need, no more and no less. And the no more is often a concern. What you don't want to have is a little bit of PII slipping in there that you neither wanted nor have a right to have. No one's out there maliciously or deliberately giving you that, but take it from us. We pull data from 10,000 sources. Things slip in, and as a recipient of that data, you have to take ownership of what's coming into your systems at all time, because once it's in your system, it's in your system, and you have responsibility. So being on top of that, monitoring and managing that, absolutely critical. In conjunction with that, you want to be sure that the data you're getting is legally and ethically sourced, right? The legal lines are defined, and you should talk to your legal teams to understand what they are. I'm certainly not a lawyer to give that advice. The ethical lines are ones that each of you have to decide for yourself, right? Where do you want to stand on that spectrum? But you want to make sure that the partners you're working with for your data have the right checks and balances in place to ensure that they are where you want them to be in terms of those lines. And that's a conversation you have to have, not make assumptions about. And I emphasize this because we often see people making that assumption and not explicitly having those conversations. And in line with all of that, you want to make sure that those partners then are really committed to the right security practices, that they are moving forward, and in particular, I think evolving with time. So that you can see that intentionality about staying clear of privacy and compliance issues. This is very much not a static world, and you want to know that they're moving with it. And all three of those work in concert. And as I've said, right, this is one area where you just don't want to take any chances. So for the expert edge here, the thing I want to really emphasize is the value of getting ahead of the curve with legislation. Don't just sort of straddle that line or skirt it. And I would highly recommend that you don't try to exploit loopholes that exist. We all know legislation's usually never perfect. And I'm not saying that from a debating of the ethics perspective. These simply aren't sustainable strategies, and the pace of legislative change, which while it feels really slow and ponderous, is actually faster than you realize. And these are not simple things to react and respond to. You want to be ahead of them, right? As an example, I think most people here are probably reasonably aware of CCPA, the California privacy legislation that's been in place for a couple of years now. But you need to be on top of what's happening everywhere. We have a team of people dedicated to being on top of this, and as a partner can certainly help you with that, because there's a lot going on, right? I wonder how many of you, and we've got the states highlighted on the screen here, were aware that Virginia, Utah, Colorado, and Connecticut, that's not in any particular order, but they've all enacted new privacy laws that go into effect in 2023. And are there similarities between what these four states have done? Yeah, absolutely, right? It's clear that likely CCPA was a starting point from which they launched and figured out their own nuances and beliefs and preferences. And so are they identical? Absolutely not, right? Because that would be too easy for all of us to deal with if everyone just had the same regulations and we had to think about it once. So what that means is we have to deal with all of them both separately as well as collectively, because we are still in the context of the USA for the context of operations that are within America only. we are still one country and we have to operate in that federal context as well as each individual state. And each of these ones has its own nuances, right? So Virginia is one where, as we've looked at that, we've seen that it's tighter than, say, CCPA in some of its opt-in requirements and some of the classifications and categories around that, but maybe a little looser in other regards. And Connecticut has this really interesting language and nuance that's based on the location of your business operations, not just residents of Connecticut. And these are all things that are not always apparent at the surface, and you need to spend the time and investment and effort thinking about it. So our general advice here, because this is really going to be messier before it's cleaner as each of 50 states works out its own plans, we'd really recommend that people consider taking their cue from GDPR, the European standard, and strive for that. I'm, again, not saying this as a lawyer, it's not legal advice and everyone has to chart their own course. But for what it's worth, that's the lens we're taking on this. And we're comfortable that that is the most conservative approach that's out there from a privacy standpoint. And we want to be on that side of the fence because that is where the march is inexorably going, and we can see that coming, and we want to be there rather than have to chase our tail to get there as we go along. So just, really be aware, keep educating yourselves. If you're working with us, as I said, we have teams looking at and thinking about this stuff. If you're not working with us, expect this and demand this of your partners. But as I've said, make sure you are owning and on top of these things. So we've talked a lot about all this business and consumer data. I want to talk a little bit about the data that you guys may have, which may have been sourced from third parties like us, but you may also have your own data, right? At the very least on your existing customers. And it's easy to get complacent about that data and think that you've got everything you need to know and that you're all set. But as we've implied a few times today, that information and richness of information is power. And the more you have, the better positioned you're going to be. You likely have multiple databases. And if you're maximizing their potential, they'll all interact with and gain value from one another. And data cleansing and enhancement is what is going to unleash more power for you, whether you're trying to deliver granular account-based experiences or just trying to provide a rich understanding of people and places to your own customers via your own solutions. Rather than theorize kind of in the clouds for you on this one, I want to share a couple of real use cases that we work with, which are fundamentally premised on the ability to enhance the data that's coming in. So in the first scenario, imagine a real-time form fill, a lead gen or registration form on your website. Using our APIs as an example, you can extract a whole lot more information about that individual who's filling in that form. You could dynamically append information to that customer record that you're creating from this. You could correct typos or errors in the information provided, right? Maybe someone transposed the digits in a phone number or the characters in an email address. And both of these are going to help you prioritize and message more effectively, which is at the root of everything we're doing. But also interesting here, as a few of our customers do, you could leverage this capability for real-time fraud detection, right? Is that person signing up on your website using someone else's address, for example? And I got to be honest, I used to think like, who does that? But I had a recent experience in the last couple of months. My parents have actually had their address used by somebody else's company. And as we've dug in, apparently it's some kind of scheme to avoid some set of taxes, which I don't fully understand. And we only discovered this because somebody slipped up and a piece of mail addressed to the company showed up at my parents' home address. And now my 80-year-old parents are working with law enforcement to clean this up. And they're very lucky. There was no direct impact on them other than now they have to report and notarize a bunch of stuff and aver officially that they have nothing to do with a shady company, et cetera, et cetera. An extreme example, right? But it's not something you want in any way affecting your business or customers. So that's a use case that becomes really interesting about that enrichment in real time. And maybe it's not a real-time enrichment that you need, but perhaps you're, that strategic rollout we were talking about earlier. You're trying to develop a plan for rollout in a geographic area. You have a list of your customers. If they're paying you, they're your customers. But an asynchronous enhancement process here may give you a much deeper insight into their It could be their revenue trends, the lines of business they operate that you might not be dealing with directly, their physical footprint, which might be a factor in the product you're rolling out and the messaging you want to deliver. So all of that, these two different scenarios actually yield the same value add through enrichment. If you're expert edge here, right, for this to work really well, perhaps the most important thing you can do is standardize your data. I don't want to get greedy here. We'd all love for the data come where every entity is uniquely, globally identified, but we need to live in the here and now. We can't run our businesses on pipe dreams. This is critical for you in the context of everyday operations, because once you've done that, you can start connecting the dots between otherwise distinct and disparate data sets, and it gives you access to greater cross-functional intelligence. Right, one of the compliments we often receive from our partners and customers is around the cleanliness of our data in terms of content and structure. And that's at the heart of what we do, right? You can't ingest 10,000 sources and pull it together without that. And that puts us in a great position to help you with it too. If you're not there already, it can always be imposing because it's a big undertaking to clean up what you have, right? It's like the person who had the contract to supply rocks for building the pyramids, and they were dragging them through the mud every day in the box to deliver them to the site of the pyramids in Giza. But every day they'd go past this other person telling them, hey, I've got these round things called wheels, and if you put them on the box, you can do your job a whole lot better. But the problem is stopping to put the wheels on would have completely destroyed that day's supply chain. And what are the ramifications of that? Short-term thinking kicks in, as we all see across our careers, I'm sure, and maybe the right long-term decision doesn't get made. So, similarly here, that one-time effort is critical, and it's value in the long term to put that in. So you've got all this enriched data now. It's well structured, it's compliant, it's up to date, it's ready to be unleashed. And this is where some of the magic happens. And it's where we often see people struggling to escape tunnel vision, right? And don't get me wrong, that tunnel vision is actually really important at the outset. You need to stay focused on why you needed to be here getting this data in the first place, but you mustn't artificially restrict yourself to the one use case you came in for. Get that right, and then ask yourself if there are other opportunities to move on to in your organization. Maybe you got access to our APIs to support your prospecting use case as your customer acquisition team is trying to beef up its understanding of targets and drive better return on spend. That's where a lot of our customers start out. But perhaps your product is a chatbot, and maybe there's an opportunity to incorporate this data into your chatbot so that you can give your customers something a little extra versus the competition, something that may not have been on the radar of your product team in the normal course of events, but you can bring in from your marketing organization cross-functionally. And we've all got these organization silos, right? Whether we're a 10,000 person organization, honestly, or a 10-person organization. There was a Forrester report very recently that said that 72% of companies see breaking down those silos and barriers around data and insights in particular was amongst their biggest challenges. So give yourself the opportunity to let the data be your tool to that transformation. Now, for the expert edge here, we often get justifiably focused on direct customer impact. Makes a lot of sense. But really be sure not to lose sight of the internal and operational use cases here. Your baseline use case may be to use our data, for example, if you're working with us, to support your local search engine. But consider using that data to also augment what you've got in Salesforce or whichever CRM you use. And I say that not just in terms of, hey, that will help you understand your customer better, certainly does that. But where it can start to get really interesting is you try to understand what's working and not working in your operation. One example that we use internally a lot is within our finance team, which is not fundamentally customer facing, except in places where you maybe don't want them to be. But for them to start profiling our business and modeling and forecasting and so on for the future, that richness of data about the customer helps us paint a story that is driving a lot of our strategic planning. So look for those opportunities inside your organization as well with the data. And finally, to pull all this together, you're going to want to work with a data partner who, possibly or hopefully is us, but maybe someone else. But whoever they are, it's a long-standing strategic decision you're going to make, and you want to do your due diligence without falling into analysis paralysis. It's critical there to ask the right questions, and as any lawyer will tell you, again, I'm not a lawyer, it's critical when you ask those questions to know the answers you're looking for or expecting when you ask them. we've got a QR code up here. So if you want to look at a few other basic questions that we think are essential for everyone, and we can certainly help you with more detail. But I want to highlight a couple of important ones that tie into what we've been talking about today. I can't overemphasize that you need to understand fundamentally how your partner is collecting and validating data. You're not asking them to unveil their IP here, but you want to know that everything's on the up and up, that you're happy with the sourcing, the validation. Are they evolving and adapting with the times, or are they just stuck on what's brought them success in the past? And along with this, you want to validate their compliance practices. Depending on your use case, maybe you only need opted-in emails rather than all emails. Can you be sure you're getting that? Are they honoring CCPA requests, and is that funneling through to the data you receive? You don't want to be running the risk of consequences of an infraction, and you certainly don't want to be passing that risk on inadvertently to your customers as well. And the other thing that's often overlooked until too late in the game, and we see this a lot of the time, is the realities around how data fulfillment happens, meaning how are you going to receive the data from this partner? It's nice in the conversations to say, yep, APIs, we all love APIs, they're great. But almost nobody wants a fire hose of 17 million, 18 million businesses just continuously coming in and unpredictable scaling updates, unpredictably scaling updates, unless you have the infrastructure already in place to handle that. So make sure that your partner can deliver to you in a way that you can accept the data. And for your expert edge here, as I said, we can help you with a checklist of things you should ask, but it's really critical for you to ruthlessly prioritize what's on those checklists, right? It's a given. We all know everybody doesn't do everything perfectly, not even us. So what are the things you need perfection in, and where else is there a good enough threshold that you can define and set, right? Are you willing to trade being closer to the danger zone on compliance in exchange for a little more data that you can use? I know where I stand on that, or where we stand on that at Data Axle, and we're happy to talk through that with you. But it's a line and decision that you have to be on top of for yourself. So to quickly summarize and encapsulate what I've talked about in the last half hour, think about the frequency at which you need your data. Be aware of the evolution and change that's going on, and ensure that you're incorporating that into your practices. Jump forward into that world of the unified individual, right? And their complete set of characteristics and attributes. Don't even think about cutting corners on privacy and compliance, right? That train is moving way faster than the headlights make it appear. And look for that extra richness that's going to give you an edge. Make sure you're busting down those silos in your own organization and leveraging this data to lead. And finally, be very, very intentional about what you need and want from your partner, and ensure that they can work with you to deliver it. So to close out, I just want to share, this is changes running through our system in real time. Got to be honest, this is recorded because I didn't want to invite technical issues trying to integrate a live internal website into an external webinar, but this is a real look at our system. And I'm just pulling here, we have a last 30-minute update internally. So in the last 40 minutes, maybe I've been talking, sorry, we've seen 814 new businesses added into the database, 134 new addresses, which may be movements or new setups, 281 new business contacts be added, and wow, this is high, 551 businesses with a new industrial classification. That feels like a cuisine edition or update for a restaurant chain that might have come in, maybe Taco Bell's new Mexican pizza, and a whole host of other odds and ends. So thank you. I think I spoke a little longer than I probably should have, so apologies for that. But I hope everyone picked up a few useful tips and ideas and launching pads for more in-depth conversations. If we do have a little time, I'm definitely happy to take some questions if you have them, and feel free to reach out of our team. Kevin, I'll hand back to you to take it from here.
If I may, Rohan, I will say that the paint and sip experience that you referenced, definitely try that. It's worth a shot. No, that was great. Thanks for walking us through all of that. As you can probably imagine, we have quite a few questions that have rolled in. We're at time, so if folks can maybe hang out for maybe 5 more minutes or so. We've got quite a few questions I would love to address, and I have been consolidating like questions to hopefully tackle a bunch in one shot. So here we go. What advice, Rohan, would you give to a smaller company working with limited resources, and any way that they can convince their management to invest more in data?
Got it. Good question. Yeah, I mean, there are certainly ways you can make that case, right? Very, very generally speaking, good, clean data it's the basis for all business intelligence, right? Not having it is going to lead to poorer results, at least, right? And that applies regardless of your use case. it's probably fairly obvious to people in the context of powering a product if the product is fundamentally built around the data, right? Like navigation, if the data's better and you invest in it, you're going to have better results. But as I've been mentioning through this session, right, it's a given as well if you're leveraging that data for prospecting, for marketing, for retention. If your company, your small company is spending money on marketing, and you likely are in some form, whatever channel or medium you're using, right, that team, I'm going to presume, is being asked to optimize that spend. And that's where leveraging good data to target is going to be a way to get to that optimization. And what's critical, frankly, however small or large you are, is being on point and very relevant in your communication or outreach, especially when you have limited spend that you're trying to work with. So the more you understand whom you're working with, the more likely you are to be able to engage them. I would say, like, please use that data well and be authentic in your outreach. Especially if it's a cold scenario. I received a LinkedIn message a couple of weeks ago, and it was telling me that engineering is like cricket, so hire our engineers because you want to move really fast without breaking things like you do on the cricket field. Didn't make a whole lot of sense. I ignored it because that person clearly hadn't understood how cricket works and had just read the Facebook approach to engineering without comprehending what it means either. So all of that's like a quick general answer to the question. If you want to talk more about your specific context, certainly reach out to us and we can help you frame that conversation appropriately.
Fantastic. There are also a bunch of questions around testing data. I will consolidate all of those to one general question, which is, how do you recommend I test my data? Essentially is the question.
Okay, great question. I'll try and keep this short, not waffle on here. The very quick, dirty answer is test regularly, test continuously, in effect, right? I'd recommend especially functional validation every time you bring data in, right? And this is even just to make sure that nothing's corrupted or damaged. It's rare, but that can always happen when you're transmitting data. I'll also add that, right, if you're talking about business data here, which a lot of us are, the ideal validation is obviously to go to the purest source of truth, which is the business themselves, right? Call, email, chat, and ask them. There's a reason our social studies teachers in school extol the virtues of a primary source. But of course, that's costly and impractical maybe for all of us to individually do. And you certainly can't do that with consumer data. So quarterly is probably a good recommended frequency for sort of a spot or sample checking and reviewing with your data partner. And this is not about trying to just find errors and point out isolated errors, right? No data set is 100% perfect. But what you probably want to do in that world is to take a sample, run a match or an update with your data partner. If that's us, then that's with us, and see what they're now saying about that same set of records that you had from whenever you last had them. And you can look there at what has or hasn't changed, extrapolate across your data set. And again, if it's us, we'll certainly be happy to work with you to see what that looks like. And then you can make an informed decision on what to do next, if anything. And I think that the other thing you should do when you're doing that sort of quarterly update, check-in, and validation is take a look at the results you're getting with the data and make sure that also feeds back into the conversation with your partner about the right data for you, right? That conversation about that shouldn't be when you sign a 3-year contract and like, this is what I need, we're good, everything's good, and let me just make sure the data's correct. It's a living, ongoing conversation, and you always want to be refining and improving. And frankly, we love to be doing that with you. Because the upshot of that might be, hey, we need to increase our frequency, or I referenced earlier today, right? We might need to change the industries where we're pulling in because this is not quite working for us, or there's something new that's opened up. So absolutely be all over that. And that was a short answer, sorry.
No, that's great. We had quite a few roll in. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I think, Rohan, we did a great job of tackling all of those in those 2 answers there. Another a lighthearted one here was, I think folks picked up what we were putting down. Is each tip the title of a song? Can you confirm or deny that quickly?
Well picked up, whoever spotted that. Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we'll put the soundtrack on Apple Music, and we can enrich the data on those artists and the albums, and pay a buck extra for the enriched data as well.
That sounds amazing.
That's awesome that people call it that.
Excellent. So again, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We're a little bit over. This was great. Once we end the webinar, once I click this red button here into my bottom right portion of my screen, a brief 4-question survey will pop up. We would love to just steal 15 more seconds of your time if you could let us know your thoughts on today's session and how we can potentially help you out moving forward. That'd be great. Um, with that, Rohan, thanks again. Everyone, thanks for your time today, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone.